Hello, and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper, and here with me today is my wonderful husband, Jordan Cooper, who you all know as the actual host of this podcast. And just a quick reminder that Justin Center is listener supported. So if you have benefited from any of the work that Justin Center has done, that includes the podcast, the books, the Widener Institute lectures, any of those things, then consider making a donation. You can do so online at justandcenter.org, and you click on the Fund Donate button, and there are a bunch of different ways to donate. And if you yourself cannot donate, you can also talk to your church and see if they would be willing to help support what Justin Center is up to. There are so many cool projects coming up, and I can say that since I'm a little bit on the outside here. Lots of cool translation efforts that are coming up that would be really cool to get funded. So just think about that in case you're interested. And so today we are talking about Jordan's new book. I'm back again. This is what I do every time Jordan has a new book out. We're talking about Makers of the Modern Mind, which I know a lot of you have been eagerly awaiting. It's based on the Makers of the Modern World video series that Jordan has done over the last 3-4 years.
Something like that. It's been quite a while.
Something like that. So if you are interested in any of these particular figures that show up in this book, or even beyond, there are lots of other figures that you've done that are not in this book that are interesting to hear about. You can click on, I believe there's like a whole series of these videos that you can find, like all linked together.
There's a playlist.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Playlist on YouTube. So you can check those out. And we're going to do our best to kind of cover, this is a long book. This is 420 something pages. I want to ask, what is this book about? Why is it interesting for people to pick up?
Yeah, sure. So this book is, the goal is to provide basically kind of an overview of some of the thinkers who have formed the way that people think today in the world. And specifically, I'm looking at the way that the academy tends to look at things. When I say the academy, I'm thinking largely in the humanities more than anything else. And the attempt to do this came out of the lectures, as you mentioned, that I had been doing on the channel for a little while. I used the title Makers of the Modern Mind, Modern World rather than Modern Mind. And I had gotten a number of comments after I started the series of people asking if I was going to talk about Henry Ford or Walt Disney. And
right.
Then I realized, okay, maybe this wasn't the best title.
It's a little too expensive. You gotta narrow it a little bit.
Yeah. So I'm not talking about everything that formed the modern world.
Right.
I'm specifically talking about thinkers.
Right.
And so this is a guide to some of those thinkers who have developed ideas on the backs of one another that have formed the way that people think and the way that people teach in universities today.
So I guess one of the main questions I've seen from people is, who is this book written for?
Yeah.
Because when you look at this, you might think this is going to be an inaccessible, extremely difficult read with tons of philosophical language, but it's not. I mean, it does have those things, but it's not totally inaccessible. So who's the intended audience for this book?
Yeah. So this book isn't written really for academics. And that's not to say that it wouldn't be, worth reading. They might not get something out of it. But this book is really written for people who just want to explore, who maybe don't know that much about philosophy, or at least that much about these particular figures. So I try to make this as accessible as possible. I think some of the subjects or figures are just difficult, just inherently, due to the ideas themselves. But the goal is that somebody who doesn't know much about philosophy, if anything, would be able to pick this book up and come away at the end of it with some general understanding of some of the tenets of philosophy in modernity and then into postmodernity.
So when I was reading this, I know this isn't a question, this is a comment, but when I was reading this, I was like, I wish I had this as a freshman in college. Yeah. I think maybe high school readers could maybe get through it if they were a little more advanced.
Yeah.
Or had some of the basic philosophical categories kind of under their belt. But I think college age, this would be sweet.
Yeah, and that's kind of the intended audience there. So some of this came out of just conversations I had with a lot of college students, and I have had for a number of years. And this goes back to when we were in college, just people that we knew,
right?
Who in universities that they were at, there were certain assumptions about the world that were taken from some of these thinkers that were never really spoken.
Yeah.
Some of these things are just basically assumed as if, well, this is just how you do things. This is how you read texts. This is how you talk about human beings. This is how you talk about ethics. And the kind of core philosophical background was often, I found, not explained within universities at all. They're just assumed. And when that happens, people just can't actually critically evaluate anything because they don't know where their ideas actually come from or what the basic assumptions about humanity or God or the world or whatever are that underlie the things that they're being taught. And, it's kind of like, does a fish know that they're in water? Right? That's just what's around them. That's just what reality is to the fish, right? And I think that's how often a lot of students think about ideas. They don't even know the water they're swimming in. They don't recognize that it's there because it's just what they're living in. And these are the assumptions especially in the disciplines of the humanities, more than other disciplines. A lot of this doesn't work in the sciences. You can't really apply Foucault in the sciences very, very well and be very successful in what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, you could try.
Yeah, and he did.
I know.
But it just doesn't really work in quite the same way. So right. Yes, I am largely thinking about a college age audience. It's not only that, but I think a student who reads this would be able to then see these ideas or patterns or assumptions in what it is that they're reading or being taught. So the goal is to be able to critically think and examine ideas so that you can actually take a step back and ask about first principles instead of just looking at symptoms.
Yes.
Which is, I think, where a lot of people go on a lot of cultural issues.
I also think, having studied it in the humanities, I often, as a college student, encountered names of people with the assumption laden in that I already knew all of what they taught. And something like this book, right, there are different sections for different movements in modern thought and sections on each thinker.
Yeah.
And it contextualizes them not only in their own kind of life. You do give some background information about their life, but you also give specifics about who they were talking to philosophically, who they were responding to, how they fit within the philosophical movements at the time. And I think that would have been so helpful.
Yeah.
Especially, I studied English literature, and I particularly love literary theory. And there's a whole section of the book about that, which I was very excited to talk about. So we'll see if we get there, because there's a lot before it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that something like this could even be helpful as like a reference book for college students if you're headed into the humanities, just as a reference guide for different thinkers. As you're reading a text and you go, oh, Hegel is mentioned. What did he teach again? Like, why are we talking about him? What were his main assumptions? This would give you, a few pages or something that would summarize it in a really succinct way. So by nature of this book being the length that it is and as broad as it is, it's hard to give every particular distinction that every thinker ever said.
Yeah.
You can't. This is one of the things that I think people might be expecting when they pick up a book like this. So why keep it at this, I want to say, overview level?
Yeah.
Why was that important to you in writing this book?
Yeah. And so I will say there's a very long bibliography, and there's a reason for that.
Right.
So there are plenty of resources if you want to delve further into these topics. And I do want to say that the majority of, almost entirely, the reading that I did of these figures was either from primary sources, reading the figures themselves, or from scholars who agree with their perspectives. So that means the bibliography is a lot of scholars who would agree generally with the ideas of these thinkers here. I think it's always best to get people's ideas directly from them instead of just critiques. It's not to say I didn't read critiques at all, but I started with more positive, certainly positive treatment. So there is a long bibliography if you want to get other sources on this stuff that's more in depth. But I think one of the problems with the academy today is that everybody's a specialist. And I understand why that's necessary, because yes, when you're talking about a lot of thinkers who have written so many books and who are responding to so many things, and there's so much in terms of their historical context, and they write such complicated prose on purpose, which a lot of thinkers do. You get debates about how to interpret. Yeah, I know, and that's so you get different schools of interpretation, and this is true in theology as much as it is in philosophy or other fields too. But when everybody is so specialized, you are unable to actually critically think about major ideas. Like, it's one thing to think about, what Gramsci said about the superstructure or something as an academic question, but it's another thing to think about the nature of, like, what is society and how do thinkers actually engage with these broader questions as a whole. So everybody's isolated into these, like, little silos in the academy, and it's not healthy. Now, of course, the danger in doing something more general is that you just inherently aren't going to understand the nuances of the scholarship on every single figure. It's an impossibility to do that. So this book is an attempt to explain the broader ideas of each of these thinkers. I do try to give different perspectives when there's a debate in terms of how these figures are to be understood. For example, I mentioned Antonio Gramsci, and I found he's a figure that there's a lot of disagreement in the secondary literature in terms of how much he departs from Marx, or how much economics play a central role versus culture in his thought. So I try to give, like, here are some different schools of interpretation. I obviously can't do everything. I obviously haven't read everything. But it is essential, if anyone is to really talk about ideas at all, to understand broader themes and broader ideas and thinkers, or else you're just going to treat knowledge as this kind of, like, isolated little bit of something, or you're just going to jump into some very particular narrow set of themes. And knowledge should really enrich life and culture in ways that I think is just not possible if you're only narrow.
Yes. Yeah, and we saw that play out. I think there's a big anxiety that people feel when they first step into scholarship, especially, and I think maybe I keep going back to college age because that's the target ministry demographic that we've been working with for over a decade.
Yeah.
I think there's this anxiety once you step into academia that you think, oh no, I don't know anything. And the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know things. And it can be completely overwhelming and feel like a task that can never be accomplished. And it can be really de-incentivizing to even read anything, because your thought is, I could read this book, but then how am I going to know what all of the other people think about this book? And I would have to read these 10 books to even have a real understanding of anything. But I think the purpose of this book being this kind of high-end gloss that gives different thinkers basically what they think, basically what they believe, and then giving bibliographic entries so that they can read more. I think that is such a cool and unique tool, and I wish I had it in college.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I hope people find it useful.
Yeah,
I hope they do. It's this is just something that's happened in intellectual history, that there are too many thinkers that are influential, and they've written too many things at this point where you just can't have a total grasp on everything.
Yeah.
So it's been observed often that Hegel is really the last great systematic thinker. Like, he's the last figure who's able to systematize all of the kind of prominent ideas within Western philosophy and create this comprehensive, cohesive system. And since Hegel's time, which was difficult enough then, there has just been so much more written and done that it's an impossibility. And so, to some extent, you have to just pick and choose some broad ideas and questions.
Yes.
Instead of trying to comprehensively understand everything, or you're never going to be able to do that.
So, as a Lutheran scholastic scholar, why this book? It's not. I guess my main question would be, what is the ministry context into which this book was written?
There's are a couple of different parts to that. So one is ministry in terms of like church ministry, and the other is in terms of maybe broader the theological world. And just in terms of practical ministry, like I said, so many people adopt assumptions unknowingly that are passed on, and they think in categories that are taken from a lot of these thinkers, even if they don't really know that that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
And it's really essential that people learn to ask those primary fundamental questions.
Questions like, what is man?
What is a human being?
Yeah. What is a human being? Why do we care about truth?
Yeah.
Why should we care about truth?
Yeah. Well, where is there truth?
Is there truth
accessible? Yeah. And often people don't ask those questions, but then they make assumptions or buy into ideas that depend on how somebody answers those questions. So I just encountered this all the time in a practical ministry context with college students who are wrestling with certain issues. And I think it's really essential that students understand the roots or assumptions that play into these particular issues. And sometimes I think someone struggling with a particular question over something that's happening culturally, sometimes just exposing the idea that lies underneath that cultural issue is an answer in and of itself.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of people, obviously, in recent years have been talking about the issue of gender and gender identity.
Right.
And so if you look at somebody, and it's obviously more complicated, a bigger question that I can give, a summary of here briefly, but
we're just chatting. It's fine.
Yeah. So
this is not a lecture.
Yeah. But if you look at, say, the most influential scholar, philosopher upon issues of gender identity, particularly the notion that gender is something that is purely socially constructed, and that it is the result of what's called gender performativity.
So a la Judith Butler.
Judith Butler would be the most significant figure here. Well, Judith Butler's entire philosophy depends upon a social constructionist view of the human being. In other words, Judith Butler denies that there is such a thing as a human essence at all, because the human being, the subject is a social construct.
Right.
And so the notion of gender being a social construct really arises out of a perception that says that human nature is a social construct in some way. So it's not actually inherent at all. Well, I think you have a much more difficult case to prove that.
Yes.
But if you recognize that this is where the notion arises that's affected our culture so much, from this basic assumption about what a human being is, and if you don't agree with that, maybe you need to start to rethink the question of gender in light of that. So that's just one example of an issue that people often talk as if it doesn't, the idea of gender identity and the way that that's expressed, particular way it's expressed today in terms of pronoun use and connection to reality and language. Like, people speak as if there aren't assumptions you need to hold, or metaphysical views about reality that you need to hold to affirm those kinds of things. So people really need to go back and actually rethink the fundamental questions, like, what is a human being?
Right. And that's why that What is a Woman documentary got so much attention, I think, because it really brought to light the fact that people hadn't even considered.
Well, yeah, and that's the problem, is like, people don't actually, and I understand why. Most people aren't academics.
Right,
and most people don't have to be academics, but people haven't actually considered some of the most fundamental questions. And the strange thing about us as human beings is that we often don't think about the most obvious questions. We often don't consciously think about the things that you think about the most. And I think the reason for that is we just kind of we assume certain things. We have some inherent ideas about who we are, those kinds of things. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's
Derrida says it's a bad thing.
Well, yes, but I would say it's part of it's. I think
Maybe.
It's part of natural law. I think there's something imprinted, inherent on the human soul, so that we have certain conceptions of the world that are just that we just assume, rightly so.
Right.
Which the modern academy often tries to challenge. So, yeah, I think I just want to get people asking some of those more fundamental questions.
Yeah, and not to drive existential dread, but to push people toward a more robust understanding of who we are and why we're here.
Yeah.
And what the purpose of life is.
Yeah, so that when issues do come up, culturally, whatever the next big thing is, that everybody's going to be
Right.
debating. If you have these kind of tools in your toolbox to be able to evaluate things and ideas,
Yes.
hopefully you'll be able to address it a little more easily.
So I also think, to that point, this book is very helpful if you are a parent of college age students. When your kids come home from college and they say, oh, my teacher was teaching XYZ.
Yes.
You have some basic understanding that you can push back and ask good questions. I think asking questions often is better than just arguing with your kids. Being able to pose the right kinds of questions to get your child thinking about their assumptions about reality is also really useful. So you begin this book further back in history than I would have expected.
Yeah, I know.
So
yeah, that's true.
I know you well enough to know that anytime I ask Jordan a question, it's always, well, first you have to take like 15 steps back and figure out this stuff ahead of time before you can even begin to talk about it. And I'm sure all of you who watch this channel have experienced this in listening to his lectures. Well, first we need to go back, and then there's a lot leading up to even beginning the discussion. So I would like to ask, why start with it's Descartes and Hume and Kant? Why begin there for this discussion? Like, what foundational principles did they bring up that are integral to the whole conversation? Yeah.
So when I initially started the series of talks that became this book, it wasn't really my plan to go back that far. But I realized that I kind of needed to, if you don't have any background in modern philosophy.
This is the most Jordan thing ever.
Yeah, I know, I do this all the time. So, and I was going weird little rabbit trails of who influenced who. And I had these figures that nobody's read in hundreds of years. But it's
actually important, which is why you're trying to...
I hope so. I hope so, yeah.
In reading it, I was like, oh, I see why this is important.
Yeah. So this really started with, I'm like, if I'm going to look at Marx, you can't really understand Marx without understanding Hegel. Because Hegel sets the basic framework for the 19th century.
Right.
People are working in Hegelian categories.
Oh, right.
So then when I talk about Hegel, though, you realize Hegel's responding to Kant. You don't really get Hegel unless you get Kant.
Right.
And then you read Kant and you realize, well, you don't really understand Kant if you don't understand the rationalism empiricism debates in that division of modern philosophy.
Right.
And so then I went back to rationalism and empiricism. And so that's where this begins. So even when you read some of the, say, critical theorists, if you look at somebody like Adorno, he's largely reacting to Kant, because Kant sets the framework for modernity, and postmodernity is a response to modernity.
Right.
And so you don't really understand, even Foucault or Derrida without having some conception of what modernity actually is. And you don't really get that without Kant. I mean, he's really a key figure. In some ways, Kant really and Hegel are the most central figures for philosophy for 20th century philosophy. So you have to get those two. So this brought me all the way back to the 17th century, and I was looking at René Descartes and then David Hume. Descartes being the rationalist, Hume being the empiricist. Rationalism essentially being this idea that truth is grounded in rational thinking.
Right.
And empiricism being a philosophy that emphasizes knowledge as it is derived through experience. And so you get these kind of two competing ways of understanding how knowledge is to be formed. And then and all sorts of things in between, really.
Then you see that all play out in the different figures.
Yes.
Whether they adopt some of it or reject some of it.
Yep.
Or why they make those decisions. Yeah. So I think it's interesting to see kind of where it starts. So that's cool.
Yeah, it is. And even go back even further than that too.
Just start at the beginning of time.
I know, because also
the word.
And then also,
yeah,
like a lot of history of modern philosophy really begins with Descartes. But then I started reading Pierre Chiron, who influenced René Descartes, and you realize, Chiron actually really introduced a lot of the problems that Descartes responding to. So you could just do this ad infinitum, I guess. You just go back. Oh, well, I mean, I guess at some point it stops, but...
One of the things I would like to know is because you have sort of uncovered a lot of these, this person influenced this person, was there any point where you were surprised and you were like, this figure was actually responding to something I didn't realize that they were responding to?
Yeah, I was surprised when I started reading more scholarship on Sharon, just how
Yeah.
much of an influence he had. And we start looking at like liberal political theory or just political theory in general in the modern world, you realize like Hugo Grotius is the major figure. And Hugo Grotius really sets the groundwork for everything in terms of political theory. And this is something I'm still finding as I'm reading 17th century works. And nobody talks about, I mean, scholarship knows of Grotius. So those who study political philosophy and history know Grotius. It's not like he's totally unknown.
But he's not like John Locke. Or
no,
something.
You think John Locke or Thomas Hobbes, the two major figures. But Grotius is relatively little studied, even in universities, unless somebody's an expert on Grotius. So you'll get some footnotes and stuff, but not an extensive treatment. So you get these little figures like that. I think maybe the most surprising thing when I started looking at thinkers in the 20th century, those who are certainly on the left politically and philosophically, is how big of an influence Nietzsche had on all of them.
Yeah, so why didn't you talk about Nietzsche in the book?
Oh my gosh, yeah, why didn't I talk about Nietzsche? So the
how dare you?
Yeah, how dare the thing with Nietzsche is he's certainly not a thinker on the left, and the subtitle of the book is Makers who Form the Modern Left. But Nietzsche did kind of form the modern left in the same way. So
opposite.
Yeah, it's strange because often Nietzsche is understood as being on the right. I mean, it's often said that Nietzsche really lays the groundwork for 20th century fascist movements. And he does. Right. But in some ways, Nietzsche also sets the groundwork for authoritarian leftist movements too. And so Nietzsche really just sets the groundwork for a philosophy that is based on really nothing but power, a philosophy where the desire is not really to seek some objective truth that you can rationally determine or debate or figure out, but that there's this kind of oppressive power dynamic underlying everything. And that's used in all different ways by people in both sides of the aisle. But Nietzsche really is this looming figure. So yeah, I didn't address Nietzsche, and that's specifically because he really is usually considered a figure on the right to some degree, depending on how you define the right, which is a little bit different from somebody like Hegel. And Hegel often actually is considered conservative too, but right after Hegel's death, you get this split off into two different groups of Hegelians, get your right Hegelians and your left Hegelians. So there's two different kind of directions immediately following Hegel. You don't really get quite the same thing with Nietzsche right away, at least, but it ends up that way.
You do mention Nietzsche quite a bit. That's
he's mentioned a lot. So you're going to see him mentioned a lot.
You will actually get a sense of it. But
just like Freud is going to be mentioned a lot too.
Yes, I was going to say Freud is another one.
Yeah, and they're so influential. But the fact is, I just couldn't cover everything in this book.
Right.
I'm like, I really should have done something on Rousseau here too. There's so many figures that I should, and I knew.
So annoying though.
Rousseau's really annoying to read, I know. And part of the reason I didn't focus much on Rousseau is because a lot of people have asked the question, what's the difference between this book and The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman?
Right. Good question.
And Trueman has an endorsement on the back of this book, but
a good endorsement too.
Yeah, and a lot of the themes are pretty similar. But mine is more focused on specific thinkers. His is kind of more trends, which deals with thinkers. He did a lot with Rousseau.
Yes.
And so maybe if you want to read more about Rousseau, that's maybe a place to go.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Nice.
But there's really nothing behind that. Like I wanted to do Althusser. I wanted to do Lacan. There are all sorts of Deleuze. There are all these figures that I wanted to write about too. But then, this would just take me the rest of my life to write this book if I did that. So at some point I know it would become inaccessible. So, maybe at some point there'll be a second volume covering other thinkers too, or something, but not at this point. I'm kind of had enough of these guys.
Yeah.
it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah. So how long did it take you to write this book then?
I don't know. It's hard to say because it was written in stages. So I didn't just sit down and write it. It started with lectures, and those lectures were based on some thinkers that I was just delving into at the time. And then those lectures, I had extensive notes, and then I'm like, okay, maybe I could work this into something publishable. And I started to do that. And then after I had like a chapter written on each of these thinkers, but it wasn't in a form that I wanted to publish. So I wanted to do more reading. And I did more reading. So if you watch the videos versus the book is better in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
One, I'm able to be more careful in a book than just in a talk.
Yeah.
But the other is I've done a lot more reading of these thinkers since then too.
Right.
So, and one of the things that I've found helpful, this is a nice thing about doing videos on YouTube before a book, is that people who are experts in these thinkers watch your videos and they get mad and tell you how you're wrong about how you interpreted this or that. But when I got those comments, I always read them and looked at the sources they recommended too. So it actually helped me look at other views on these. So
tell Jordan more in the comments, please.
Well, if you know what you're talking about, that's fine. You can push back and give me I will read them. I do read.
Yeah.
I don't read stupid critiques or pay attention to them, but
if
you're just going to yell. But if you want to recommend, hey, here's a scholar who interprets this very differently.
Right.
I think you're misunderstanding this or this. And I went back and did that for all the comments that I got like that for these thinkers. And and sometimes I read the other sources and I'm like, no, I said exactly what the scholarship says.
Right.
But there are times where I'm like, okay, well, there's a very different school of thought. So Gramsci, for example, has wildly different interpreters.
Right. And this is what happens when you write inaccessibly, though.
I know. And Gramsci's not actually that inaccessible compared to a lot of the others. But a lot of, especially when you get to somebody like Derrida, what's part of his whole thing is, right, he writes inaccessibly on purpose.
Yes, it's true.
Or Karl Barth in theology. Not that he's in this book. Sorry to the Barthians, but I think the trend of writing so obscurely that developed at the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century is just so unhelpful.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they just desired that after their death, there'd be a lot of scholarship on their works, because if nobody can understand you, then you get all sorts of schools of thought about what you think. And, then you stay relevant, I guess.
So I do want to get into some of the more meat of the book.
Yeah.
We did talk a little bit about why you started where you started.
Sure.
But there's another kind of foundational level that you talk about in The Birth of Modern Liberalism.
Yeah.
That ends up being really relevant to the rest of the book too. Can you describe why that was important or why that's foundational for the rest of the book? Yeah,
so there's been a lot of discussion about liberal political philosophy recently because of the rise of post-liberalism. And I'm not a post-liberal, but I do think that in order to understand some of the assumptions that we have about the world, we do have to look at some of the assumptions of liberalism, liberal political philosophy. Because, again, those are just ideas that people take for granted, our emphasis especially on human freedom, the value of the individual.
Yes.
These kind of things they're just inherited assumptions. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean they're inherently wrong. But I will say that some of them are wrong, the ways that those things are perceived. But whether it's right or wrong, we do need to be aware of our assumptions and be able to see where those ideas come from so that we can evaluate them. And the end of your evaluation may be, no, I think that's a right assumption, but maybe that, no, I think maybe that is a wrong assumption. So I don't think we should just take those assumptions for granted. And so the birth of liberalism, it's a very complicated subject, and I have too many thoughts to explain in some short format like this. But all of the debates about political philosophy in the Western world really stem from the birth of liberalism. It's a very different way of thinking about the human being and the human person's relationship to the state. Things like, religious pluralism is really a very new idea that became a kind of necessity at that time. And so I deal with three figures in liberalism: John Locke, Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes is usually said to be kind of the father of liberalism. Really, Grotius is. There's a little section on Grotius, but not as much as there probably should be.
Poor Grotius. Not getting the love.
Poor Grotius. It's kind of annoying, honestly, though. But so you get Grotius, then you get Hobbes, and then John Locke. John Locke is the most important formulator of political philosophy, certainly for the United States.
Right.
That's where liberalism kind of takes its most important form, I guess. But what I want to highlight here in terms of what leads to the other thinkers, because John Locke's political theory is totally different from Karl Marx's theory, like completely different.
Absolutely.
And they're very different. Well, within liberalism, you get very different perspectives. And so you have a kind of liberalism that is, conservative when we usually use the word conservative or conservatism, we're talking about a form of liberalism most of the time.
Yeah.
And so you think of somebody like Edmund Burke. And so from liberalism, you have a right liberalism and a left liberalism. And so I use the example of left liberalism from Thomas Paine. And there's been some work done on Thomas Paine versus Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is usually said to be the father of modern conservatism. And Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke kind of went back and forth on issues of revolution, because Burke supported the American Revolution, but was very opposed to the French Revolution. Thomas Paine supported any revolution he could find. Pain's story is a really interesting one, because he was so influential in the American Revolution for his book Common Sense, which I read that in like high school.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people did. Yeah. It's worth reading Paine outside of Common Sense, though, because he doesn't appear to have much common sense outside of that text. He really, he's so extreme. But what I wanted to highlight what I wanted to highlight in Thomas Paine, I could have done this through Rousseau to some degree as well, is one way of thinking about inheritance and the inheritance of earlier ideas or structures. And Paine argues essentially that you can only make a contract or a social contract, a political contract, if, with the living. Like the dead don't really speak to the living at all.
Right.
And so Paine has this idea, basically, you just rewrite your constitution every generation, which sounds like a horrendous idea. But what I was trying to highlight there is a theme that we have within, and not just political theory, but in the modern world in general, a question of how is it that we relate to the past? How does it, and that's one that, Hegel deals with quite extensively and others do as well. But with Paine, you get this idea that the past is something to be kind of resented in some way, that the past is kind of oppressive. Past structures are often oppressive. And we always need to be pushing towards something new, something more just, something freer. And this is a generation by generation development of society in some positive way. So I think that it's really important to understand Paine, but it could be other people other than Paine. And Paine's not like a philosopher, really. He's but he was a popular writer. Right. But he gives you an idea of, or he's an example of certain themes that you're going to see developing in revolutionary kind of attitudes in political theory.
It's so interesting because as you're explaining this, right, it makes me think about all of the theological movements too. In recent time,
I know.
Where all of a sudden you see people saying we should just totally reinvent how we interpret the Bible. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and
these are they're connected.
I know, and that's what's interesting about having this kind of high level understanding of all of these different modern thinkers.
Yeah,
because it shows how these presuppositions that are brought about by certain thinkers are then uncritically adopted by later thinkers as being, well, this is just how we do it.
Yep.
The next thing that happens in your book, we move from the birth of modern liberalism into kind of Marxist thought. Yeah. And I think one of the things that really surprised me about this section is that relationship between Hegel and Marx that I wasn't totally aware.
Yeah, sure.
They really do play on each other quite a bit. And this is probably just me being naive, but do you want to talk about that a little bit and why those thinkers then set the framework that then brought about?
Yeah. So if you're thinking about Marx,
or radical people.
Yeah. If you think about Marx versus, say, John Locke, the question is how do these two guys develop? Right. They're not that far apart from each other. It's relatively far apart time-wise. But
where did they come from?
But they're the kind of two trends within modern political thought. And within the most extreme Lockeans, you get a radical individualism. I don't think it's fair to call Locke a radical individualist, but out of that does come a radical individualism. Yeah. But then out of Marx comes a collectivism where the individual doesn't really matter at all. And
it's an opposite.
Yeah, Marxist regimes don't tend to value the life of the individual, is quite evident just historically. So you get these two trends of individualism versus collectivism. Those are philosophical trends too. So they're not just in the realm of politics.
Right. But those lines do get blurred with this kind of generation of thinkers too.
They do. So they're related. So political theory and political philosophy is always going to be related to other philosophy too. It's not just this isolated sphere. So
Yes.
different philosophical fields always influence each other. And you can look at, as you said before, theology in relation to any of this stuff too, because
Right.
everything follows the same kind of general trends.
Yeah.
And in some ways, this goes back to one of the oldest philosophical questions, which is the relation between the one and the many.
Yeah.
And so that, you can go back to, 600 BC to talk about this debate. But it does manifest itself in this particular way politically. So on the one hand, you're getting this kind of radical subjectivism and individualism that develops into, especially the more extreme forms of liberalism. And then you get a focus on the, collective that you find in an extreme form within somebody like Karl Marx.
Right.
So how does Hegel play into all of this? Well, Hegel is trying to answer this question of the one and the many, who, Kant deals with this issue as well, or sometimes it's talked about as the relation between the subject and object. How do I, as an individual subject, relate to the objects of the world around me?
Right.
Or subjects around me? Again, much more than I could actually summarize here.
Read the book.
So yeah, read the book. And
Buy the book. It's on Amazon.
So Hegel is dealing with what is a perceived kind of isolation of the individual and the kind of break between the individual and the world. But he's dealing with this kind of radical type of individualism that's developed. And Hegel sees all of reality as kind of consumed into this one thing that he calls the Geist, which is translated as like world spirit, oftentimes. And this is one of the most complicated things to understand in this, just in modern philosophy in general. But essentially, maybe two things to say to just summarize what the influence of Hegel is here. One is that he sees truth in reality really as historical process.
Right.
And so he sees that there is this development of kind of world history that we are in the midst of. And the other thing is to say that he emphasizes unity, right? So he emphasizes the unity of the subjects with the world around us, and unity between people with one another. Now, Karl Marx takes Hegel's what's called his historicism, his emphasis on truth and history, which, to be clear, Hegel's historicism is not inherently like a leftist kind of thing. Hegel actually is often considered a conservative because he takes history very seriously, and he sees
because it's moving.
Yeah, because it's moving
in one particular direction,
and it has a goal.
Yeah,
there's an end. There's a purpose in history. So in some ways, Hegel, like he's coming from a Lutheran background. So does Kant. So do a lot of these thinkers. So
fun fact.
Yeah. So this is connected to Lutheran theology and history too, which makes me more interested in a lot of these questions. There are a lot of good Lutheran responses to Hegel, and then a bunch of Hegel's students or early Hegelians actually become confessional Lutherans later.
Yeah. But remember when I mentioned those translation projects earlier?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
That's what I'm talking about.
These are people that I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Part of that.
So Hegel sees that history actually has a meaning. Like there's purpose in reality. And he says that history matters, community matters. Things that are I think are good. So Marx is one of the left Hegelians. So there's the right-leaning group and the left-leaning group. The left Hegelians develop what's called historical materialism, which means that all that exists is the material and matter, right?
Yeah.
And so Hegel talks about, he's an idealist. He prizes ideas. He talks about the spirit and the different interpretations of what Hegel means by spirit. It's clear that there's at least some theological background in terms of what he means by that.
Right.
And there, again, are different reads of interpretations of Hegel, but I don't want to get into that. So one direction that Hegelian thought goes is just in terms of matter. Everything is just material, physical. And historical materialism takes Hegel's focus on history and inevitable development and defines history, though, in terms of economics. At least that's the way Marx does it.
Right.
He's largely drawing on Ludwig Feuerbach here. His theses on Feuerbach are very important. It's a very important text to understand early Marx and what he's doing. And I think when you read the theses on Feuerbach, in particular, the way he talks about humanity, he says that, humanity is the sum total of man's social relations, not an inherent essence in itself. So in other words,
so upsetting.
What we are as human beings is defined by our social relations.
It's so sad.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult claim to make because there's no inherent essence. There's nothing that precedes social relations. And in some ways you could say kind of Hegel does that, but not at all in the same way that Marx does that. It's quite different. So the theses on Feuerbach actually were a major influence on Judith Butler.
Yeah, you can see that.
And she cites those theses a lot.
Yeah.
And you can see this in strains of Marxist thought. There are those who prize the early Marx versus the later Marx. The early Marx is much more Hegelian philosophical. Later Marx really kind of drops that. That's not really his concern at that
purely
point.
economic.
It's purely economic.
Yeah.
And so there are people today who want to say that you can have, it's just like an economic theory, I see, Marx is economic. It's not just an economic theory. And it's an economic theory that depends upon a particular view of reality that is, inherently a materialist one. So Marx develops what he calls historical materialism, where there is this goal in history, and history is a process, but it's more like a biological organism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's not about like purpose in the sense that we would think it's something transcendent,
right?
Something like that. So it's not talking about history in terms of like redemption or the goal that God has destined his creation for or something. We're talking about just inevitable kind of biological phenomena. So he calls this scientific.
Yeah.
And so he calls it scientific socialism. And in this scientific socialism, as he's describing it, biological organisms just have a life cycle. They're going to do the same things, develop in the same ways. And he says this is the way that societies develop too. And so he sees that there is this inevitable move into socialism or communism.
Yeah.
And so he sees that as a biological necessity.
Right.
It's like the fact that if you live long enough, you're going to grow up. You're going to show the signs of aging. It's inevitable. You can't just like escape it.
Right.
So it's inevitable that capitalism is going to develop eventually into socialism and his form of socialism. Now, I think it's important to say his form of socialism because socialism certainly didn't develop with Marx. There are other socialisms at this time, and not all of them are nearly as extreme as Marx's view and come from very different assumptions. So I think it's important to say, and it is also important to see that the context really is the Industrial Revolution at this point.
Yes.
Which causes all sorts of issues. But this is a response partially to the Industrial Revolution. So go. Yeah.
From Marx, though, then you get the scariest guys, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think I found Marcuse,
yeah,
and Lukács to be the scariest figures in the book. And this is really when it felt like all of a sudden there was this descent into absolute madness in the book. Yeah. And from there, it's just downhill. Like how do I describe the feeling that I had reading that? It was so unsettling reading them. Because all of a sudden you have everything is political.
Yeah.
Everything is societal revolution. We need to overthrow the academy, kick out all the people we don't like. And then it was really the first time that you really see the weaponization of art and literature to bring about societal revolution. And to me, that was the most unsettling thing. And maybe it's because I spent my time studying literary theory that you see the manifestations of that. And then when you mess up how you understand reading texts, all of a sudden you have people who are completely uncritical. And all of a sudden you have no idea, like you can't retrieve what's good because you can't read properly.
Oh, yeah.
It totally like unsettles everything. So
it does. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to give us a little bit of background on those figures and fill us in a little bit about, aside from them just being kind of unsettling and scary to me.
Yeah. So you do have, I will say, you do have the roots of this stuff in Marx and I actually think more so Engels. And when you read Engels' own writing, it seems like Engels was more opposed to Christianity than Marx was, significantly so. Not that Marx was pro-religion, he wasn't. But he does, there's this quote where religion is referred to as like the opiate of the masses that people often cite.
Yeah.
But he actually didn't mean that in a negative way.
Right, no, that was
was kind of interesting. And this is...
It's good for them. It keeps them passive. It keeps them happy.
Well, well, what he's saying is, people often interpret that, or you hear that and you're like, oh, well, basically, religion is just this evil weapon that's used to pacify people.
Right.
But that's not actually how Marx means it. He means religion was able to give people a kind of hope in the midst of their exploitation. That's what he means.
Right.
So he doesn't see it as entirely negative, but he does say, but we don't need that anymore.
Yeah.
So he really does try to replace religion with communism.
Yeah.
So he does, even though it's not maybe as extreme and stated as extremely as in some later thinkers, the roots of these ideas are kind of already there.
But that's what's interesting, that you
it-
start to see these lines that kind of draw
yeah.
people together.
Yes. Yeah. So, but for Marx, everything is economic. I mean, he defines everything in terms of economics, like absolutely everything. So you do have this kind of totalizing idea.
Mm-hmm.
And you do see this, though, become more extreme, as I said, when you get to, you mentioned Lukács first, so let's talk about him. So Lukács, he is the father of what's sometimes called Marxist humanism or Western Marxism. And the name, both of those names, come from the fact that Lukács studied literature. I mean, that was his doctorate was on the novel.
Yeah.
And Lukács was more interested in the early Marx than the later Marx, the more Hegelian Marx.
Right.
So that did a couple things. One is that he really emphasized this idea of the totality, the interconnectedness of all knowledge and reality, which comes from Hegel, but this is now interpreted in such a way that all things are political, right? If politics is at the center of reality, and if everything is about this kind of totality, all things are interconnected, that means everything is political. So everything needs to be looked at through the lens of politics, and specifically revolutionary politics.
Doesn't that sound like our culture right now?
Very much so.
Yeah.
So, and then you get, in this, you could argue this is in Marx, but it's really in like the second generation of Marxists, it's more prominent. What Ludwig von Mises calls the polylogism, logos meaning reason, truth. So there are many truths. You can't really, there's no kind of core truth that can be accessed objectively by a bunch of people that maybe disagree on this or that. Instead, truth or accessibility to truth is defined by your place within the battle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, right? So the battle between the haves and the have-nots, or whatever kind of terms you want to use to define that. And essentially, this leads for Lukács to a perspective which says that reality is actually only really known as it is by the oppressed classes.
Yep.
So the question then, when you're dealing with scholarship from here, is not so much the question of what is true, but instead, what is the class dynamic that's in the midst of this, say, work of art or this philosophical question?
Right.
So you're not even examining things to find truth at all. You're just examining things to find the dynamic underneath.
I also think that plays out now.
I mean, it's everywhere.
In our academy, because you can't write on certain topics if you are not that marginalized class who has been affected by it.
Yep.
So, for example, me writing a book about assisted reproductive technologies, which I'm working on, right? I can't make that argument, or I can't talk about those things if I have not personally used them.
Yes.
So you have to even make an argument when you're pitching to publishers that says, this is why I care about it. This is why I'm some kind of marginalized class. And I think that it's stupid.
No, it's exactly right. I mean, and it is stupid. But it's this idea that there is no kind of accessible truth apart from your own experience.
Exactly.
It's just the experience and what class you belong to. So you get this, just an example of how this works today in a lot of discussions in the culture is pro-life issues.
Oh, totally.
Because the question is not, are you right or wrong? Is this a life? Does life begin at conception? What exactly is life? The real questions that you got to ask that need to be discussed, because that's the core of the question.
And evaluating even biological,
of course,
truths about those things. Yeah.
Those are the questions that need to be discussed. But instead, people just point out, the gender of the lawmaker who passed a law. Well, it's completely irrelevant.
It is.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the person was a horrible, evil person who instituted a certain law. That doesn't inherently make a law unjust.
Right.
So like that's not really the question. The question is, well, is it right or is it wrong? Is this a just law or is it not a just law? And you can only do that by actually engaging with reasonable arguments if you both have the assumption that truth is actually identifiable.
Yes.
And what's identifiable is not merely just power and who wields power. Of course, people have power and people abuse power, but that's not all there is to reality. So, with Lukács, you get this totalizing of the political, and Lukács he's addressing a question. And this is a question that every Marxist is dealing with after Marx.
Yeah.
Which is, why did the revolution happen? Because Marx is like, well, it's just inevitable. Of course it's going to happen. Of course, there's going to be this end to capitalism, and then we're going to have these socialist societies. That's just the inevitable progress of history. And this obviously didn't happen. And so people then start to ask the question, well, why didn't we have these socialist revolutions that Marx told us we would? And so in evaluating that question of why that didn't happen, people start to then emphasize subjectivity, to say that, well, Marx saw everything as just this objective, historical, material phenomena that was like a machine, but he didn't actually pay attention enough to Hegel's notion of subjectivity. And so if you start to focus on subjectivity, you start to say, okay, well, if it's not inevitable, how do we then make people want the revolution to happen? So the emphasis shifts.
Yeah.
That's where now you bring in questions of culture, literature, and then these things become tools to awaken class consciousness so that the revolution can happen.
It's so interesting to me because it seems to be this kind of false prophet office that they're taking upon themselves.
Yeah.
That all of a sudden they're the ones who are tasked. They stand above the classes and they get to proclaim what is true and the oppression of the oppressed class in order to awaken them. Mm-hmm. But they get to stand outside of that and not be criticized.
Yeah. And that's a point I make throughout this book, is that the Marxist intellectual does kind of take this almost prophetic role in these ideologies, because it's argued that, truth is really only accessible to the consciousness of the oppressed class, the exploited class.
Yeah.
Which is the proletariat, right? And the proletariat, though, as a whole, doesn't support Marxism. And that's true in most cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Marxist revolutions tend to be driven by intellectuals in the academy. So if truth is only accessible through class consciousness, which is the property of the proletariat, but the proletariat doesn't support Marxism, well, how does this work?
How do you make this happen?
And so the argument is often made that this class consciousness is something that is not actually recognized. So, Lukács says this explicitly, that you cannot identify the class consciousness with the actual beliefs of the working class. So there's a kind of repression. So you see,
they're so oppressed that they don't even know that they're oppressed.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you see this notion of repression, Freud's idea of repression that's used. Marcuse especially is Freudian as one-dimensional man. It's a very Freudian influenced work, though at least the little I've read from those who are scholars of Freud say that Marcuse completely misunderstands Freud. But but I'm not an expert on Freud either, so what the heck do I know? But there's this idea that you have this kind of, you're repressing these feelings of oppression or exploitation. And so then that needs to be awakened. And so the role of the academic or the intellectual, the Marxist, is to awaken people to their real situation. And that's where art plays a role. And so someone like Lukács supports only realism in art.
Yes.
And you get this in the Soviet Union when you had Soviet realism was the kind of official, the only way to do art. And not all Marxists believe this. And man, that is a boring view of art. So the purpose is just to portray reality as it is, so people see the exploitation. If you want a good critique of Lukács, just read The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, because there's a character that's based on Lukács, and it's so funny. It's The way he's portrayed is hilarious.
That's awesome. I just started that book, so I'm excited to get there.
Maybe my favorite. I mean, top 3 favorite novels of all time. I'll say.
But it's also huge.
It's huge. It's so good, though.
It's an endeavor.
It's so
for
good.
sure.
And it's really actually good on all of these issues because he portrays these different kind of intellectual trends with different characters.
So this is one of the things that Jordan and I really bonded over when we first started dating, is that I love books that are all philosophy. Basically, like Russian literature is all like, there are different people kind of standing in for different philosophical thought, and they're all having conversations. So we overlap quite a bit on this on this point. That's
if you love like the book, if you like Brothers Karamazov, if you've read that, Magic Mountain is very much in the same vein in that you have particular characters representing these different philosophies.
Yeah, Tolstoy does this all the time too. Like it's super interesting. I love that, because then you kind of see how it plays out in real life in a way that you wouldn't reading a philosophy textbook. And I think that's what is so powerful about novels in general, is that you have the power to really personify these kind of ideas.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
To your point.
Absolutely. So, but these guys kind of see that.
Yeah.
So they want to use the arts just for political purposes. And so Lukács, I mean, we actually see what he did. I mean, he gets a position in the brief, communist government in Hungary, and he orders some of his own men to be executed. And he fires every non-communist professor.
Yeah, scary.
And so it's coercive force. I mean, it's tyrannical. I mean, you enter into the institution and you fire everybody that doesn't affirm your ideas and impose it upon a society. It's very much a top-down kind of thing, which doesn't make any sense in light of the whole system. So
that's the whole thing.
This is the weird thing about, and this is still the case, that Marxists tend to not be those who were from the lower classes. Gramsci is going to be the major exception to that, because he was from an oppressed people group, and he did see it like firsthand. But for the most part, these are people who were, upper middle class, people who were, barons, or like, and they're the voice of the oppressed proletariat.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of and people notice this all the time. This is still the case.
Yeah.
That those who tend to be more left-leaning, I mean, in American culture, at least it's the case, tend to be those who are most well-educated, have a higher income. And obviously not everybody's left-leaning is a Marxist, but there is this tension that doesn't really seem to make sense.
But if you understand that kind of prophetic role, then it does. That's how they justify it to themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the idea is, well, it is okay for someone to be in power, just not those people.
Yeah.
And so they talk about having a new leadership class from the proletariat that cares about proletarian interests.
Yeah.
And the fact is, like, every dictator in history says that they're all about the poor, the working class, the common man, and they're going to defeat the old powers and bring something new. I mean, do you see this in, with fascism too? They do the same kind of thing, same kind of rhetoric. And so
it sounds appealing until those people are abusing power too.
Yeah. And the thing is, they will. Like, of course they will. The fact is, it's not an issue. This is part of the problem, is evil is always seen as this kind of class dynamic where you have a certain group that's evil.
Right.
And as long as the right group or people are in power, you're not going to have these issues, when in reality, evil is something that is inherent to all of us. It's a more universal problem. There's no easy, and I think this is what people like, is it feels like an easy solution.
Right.
To say, well, only if we do this and bring justice in this way and get rid of this people or that people or take them out of power. And again, this is all authoritarian governments. The 20th century, we see this all over the place. And all you're doing is just giving another group of people power, but you're giving a group of people power that's often unchecked because they don't have the restraints of history, and they don't have the restraints of the broader political systems that have developed over time.
Right.
And so if you get rid of all institutions and institute new leader who's going to be just and support us, a new group, well, now they have no one to hold them accountable. Now they have like this absolute power. They don't have the checks and balances that come with older institutions.
Or you just have constant revolution.
Or you just have constant revolution.
Which,
just be like the French.
Yeah. Just revolutionize over and over and over again. Yeah. Okay, so moving forward in history, right? Later in history, we have this development of Marxism, the people that kind of come from Marxist thought, but then it shifts into existentialism and structuralism and kind of how they hang together.
Well, you have Saussure, who's structuralism, and then you have Roland Barthes, really the key figure there for post-structuralism. Or the kind of bridge between structuralism and post-structuralism. Yeah.
So as a literary theory person, these are all the guys that I read all the time in college, and all of their thoughts kind of impacted all of how we understand literature nowadays, whether it's we agree or we disagree with these guys.
Yeah. You get this linguistic turn where you move away from questions about metaphysics, so kind of what is reality, or questions of epistemology, which kind of tended to dominate the early modern era, which is how do you know anything, to issues of language, with an understanding that kind of language is the way that we perceive the world. Language forms the way that we think. Language forms how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, those kinds of things. And so linguistic theory is important. It's really interesting. It's very interesting. A lot of stuff happened in the 20th century. Wittgenstein is probably the most influential figure there within the linguistic turn that he's not addressed here. But I'm addressing
mentioned him.
Yeah, I think he gets mentioned.
He gets mentioned. He's there somewhere, just not a huge section.
Yeah, just like Austin and speech act theory is mentioned.
Also mentioned.
Searle's speech act theory as well is mentioned there, but that's not the focus. So, because I'm looking at more the politicized way that people look at language.
Those guys are constructive.
Yes.
And the figures that you focus on are the destructive ones.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I do deal with Saussure, who I don't think is destructive.
He's not destructive.
I think Saussure's pretty interesting.
He's my favorite of the bunch.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading him.
Yeah.
And some of his stuff actually is I was just reading William of Ockham on language recently. I'm like, there's a lot of parallels there, but that's not here nor there.
I feel like he died so early that we didn't get a full development of his thought. So I think the what we do have is really interesting and starts a lot of good conversations.
It does. And
that's
he's not a pure subjectivist in the way that he's talking at all, which is why you have post-structuralism.
No, because a referent, like the language that you use has a referent.
Yes.
Which is a sort of realism.
It is, but he never goes beyond the language itself. And that's the thing, is that he's not really moving toward a actual identifiable essence within language. But there are structuralist realists too.
Yes.
That use Saussure in a realist sense, which you can totally do. Like, there are interesting insights in Saussure. So he's totally worth engaging.
Yeah.
And he does have good insights just in terms of how language as a whole system works, which are, I think, important questions to ask.
Yeah.
But what Saussure does is he moves the conversation about language so that in the 19th century, people are more studying linguistics in terms of its development in history. How did language develop?
Right.
You talk about etymology and stuff.
Yeah.
Like, how did this word come to be? How did these languages develop? It's still, of course, a school of thought.
How do languages borrow different words from each other, or
which again,
or adapt different systems?
It's an important field of study.
Yeah.
Because everything moves toward history because of Hegel in the 19th century, and then Darwin. People are looking at language in almost an evolutionary kind of way too. How does language evolve? But he says, well, I want to look at language as a system as it functions. So he says you can just kind of stop language at any time in history. And let's not just talk about how it develops, but say, how are these words functioning? How does language function as a whole system that binds people together in a particular time? So that's the shift there that is then incorporated by some of these other thinkers. So Roland Barthes is the first real post-structuralist. He's kind of this bridge. And then you have Derrida as well, who's post-structuralist, and Foucault's considered a post-structuralist. But Foucault doesn't deal so much with literature like Derrida does.
He's a historian.
Well, he pretends to be one, I guess. So he's really not.
Oh, no.
But he's not. Like,
oh, no.
And his books were critiqued on publication for just being so unhistorical.
I know.
I mean, it's so... Yeah.
We'll get there.
He's really not a historian, but he proclaims himself to be, and does, for whatever reason, have a say in how people do history today.
That's a whole other thing.
It is. So within literary theory, so one important thing to recognize is that Saussure is more concerned, as I already mentioned, more with how language works as a cohesive system in itself.
Yeah.
So he's not concerned with how it is that language relates to things in the real world, but how language is a kind of self-contained system.
Right.
And so the understanding of language is found within language itself, not within some essence that it identifies.
Yeah.
Which is very different from like a Platonic view of language.
Right.
So where, what's the meaning found when you say the word red? Well, the meaning is found in the universal essence of redness that you are identifying.
Yes.
So you're identifying something real. So in other words, language has meaning external to language.
Yes.
So Saussure shifts the conversation to just language as it functions as a system in itself. People like, Roland Barthes and Derrida are going to ultimately say there is no meaning outside of language. Like that's all there is. There's no reality really outside of language at all.
Yeah, but Derrida goes even further than that. And
yes.
And it's an intentional, language should be used to intentionally destroy things or destroy meaning. Yeah.
Yeah. But Barthes says things like that too.
He does.
It critiques meaning, he says.
Yeah.
Purposefully, like that's the point. You critique meaning. It's not to construct positive meaning. Whereas someone like Saussure is talking about a positive construction of linguistic systems and how it positively functions and
that's what I'm saying about the construction versus destruction.
Right.
And I think a lot of people use the term deconstruction now. We hear it a lot in evangelical circles. It's not that, right? When we talk about the philosophical movement that is deconstruction or the literary theory movement that is deconstruction, it functions very, very differently.
Totally different. It's a totally different thing than what people. It doesn't mean destruction. Yeah,
right.
That's what people think it means. It doesn't.
Right. So Derrida functions along the lines of binary opposition. So he wants to bring out, the different power structures and the privileged idea versus the unprivileged idea, and the goal of literature or looking at literature is that we can invert those binaries and the idea is to de-center what has been centered. So, and we adopt this language in our culture now too.
Well, it's all Derrida. Yeah, I know.
It's all Derrida. It's this, I'm trying to think of a good example.
Like Eurocentrism or something.
Eurocentrism.
This is all very Derridian, yeah.
Yeah. Anytime we say something centrism, that's basically just taking Derrida's idea of what things in culture are. So
Derrida's contention is really that things are only formed in opposition to other things.
Yes.
And so there aren't actual inherent essences of things themselves, but there are just contrasts.
Yes.
And so we have so the world needs to be understood really as like this thing versus this thing.
Yes.
And so we form ideas based on contrast and opposition.
Yeah.
But none of those are objective. They're just ideologies.
Yes.
So they're enforced from above or whatever. And so there is no inherent essence of either of those things or inherent hierarchy of anything. So for Derrida, he's going to say, we just construct these hierarchies as all kind of oppressive. We construct oppressive hierarchies and privilege things over other things. And so everything needs to be viewed through that lens. And so that's why so much of the way people view the world today is just asking the question of what's the hierarchy? What's been privileged over what?
Yes. And how do we go about dismantling that?
Yeah.
Reversing it. So it's not even about, I think some people will play it out like it's about equality. No,
it's not. That's not the point.
It's about actual complete inversion.
Yeah.
So, and I think male versus female becomes one of the key ways. And when you look at feminist critical theory, that's the application that you get is what happens if you take a text and you invert the binaries and say the women are the privileged ones in the text and the men are not, or the women have the power and the men do not. And what does that do to the text, basically? So it's destroying meaning.
Yeah, that's the point.
And the root of that is Roland Barthes' death of the author, I think. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so Roland Barthes has this essay, The Death of the Author, and he's writing at the same time as Derrida. So they kind of develop very similar. They're not exactly the same, but they develop similar ideas at the same time.
Yeah.
And so Roland Barthes has this very, very influential essay called The Death of the Author, where he critiques this idea that we need to understand the intent of the author in reading a text.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the meaning in a text is solely determined by what the author meant. And to some extent, you can kind of understand what he's trying to say in that especially in the 19th century, you did have approaches to text that wanted to try to peer into like the mind of the author to say you can only understand this, exactly what he was thinking and exactly what. So you can get this kind of obsessive, which is really never going to lead you anywhere.
No.
So there's obviously an extreme view that goes in that direction, but he would say that we don't really have to understand the meaning of the author really at all in order to understand the meaning in a text, because language is a system in itself. And so he's going to say texts are things in themselves. They're not something that points to meaning elsewhere.
Right.
And so he's going to say that good texts are essentially just things in themselves. They don't have any objective referent outside of them. So he's going to privilege the kinds of writing that kind of play with nonsense or just kind of play with words. And
this is such a departure from how texts have always been understood too.
Yeah.
And so I think, I mean, I would write something to convey something that I think in my absence.
Right.
And this is
course.
This is a total radical undoing of that, which is to say the author in their absence their person doesn't influence it at all, which is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's going to say the death of the author is the birth of the reader.
Yeah.
And so we can really understand texts if we get rid of authorial intent. Now, Barth isn't going to just say that reading a text is purely subjective.
Although people who follow him, that's how it manifests.
That is how it manifests. So that does develop pretty, like reader response criticism this develops right after Barth.
Which, at least when we were in college, was the default.
Oh, it's all over the place.
Interpretation method at most colleges.
Yeah, and it's not just with literature. You see this in the world of art as well.
Yeah. It's not about what they meant to do. It's about how you interpret it or how it affects you personally.
So what Barth talks about is he talks about how ideas, words, phrases, concepts aren't just something that belong to the author, but they're things that belong to society. Mm-hmm. And they're things that develop over time and mean different things to different people. So it's a little bit more complicated and nuanced than just saying there's pure subjectivity, but that's kind of the inevitable end of where he goes. I think the thing about Barth that I think is most annoying in reading Barth, but is most really important is that he argues that most texts are products of ideology or myth.
Yes.
So he has this, and you could buy like multiple volumes in English published of his essays. He's got a bunch of essays on myths where he kind of interprets things. He's got one on like professional wrestling that's really well known.
Yeah.
Where he takes apart, and it is interesting. He takes apart some of the ideas in professional wrestling, but he's really trying to challenge the things that we privilege as like high culture versus low culture, really, and saying you get the same themes in professional wrestling that you get in opera, which, is actually to some extent he's right.
Yeah.
I still don't think there's no such thing as saying one art form is still inherently better than another.
Yeah, well, it has to do with beauty and all of these other
there's some objectivity.
Transcendent objectivity that he doesn't believe exists.
Yeah. Nothing against professional wrestling. I used to, as a kid, I used to watch professional wrestling back in the day. Not in a very long time. I have no desire to do so anymore. Yeah. But he talks about mythology as essentially being these political ideas. Because he's taking this idea that you find in people like Lukács that everything is the political. Mm-hmm. And so he says that mythology is the political ideas that are kind of couched under other things. Mm-hmm. So there's always an underlying political something underneath. So you have to like dig underneath to find what's the real core of what they're really doing. Yeah. They're just hiding what they really think. And so he then says that there's only one kind of speech that is not myth, and that's revolutionary speech. So he basically says
everything I don't like is myth.
Yeah. Instead of actually engaging with ideas that he disagrees with, he just essentially says, well, everything that isn't what I'm saying is just myth, so you just dismiss it out of hand. So it gets rid of any rational inquiry. You can't actually have a debate about anything.
Right.
because there is no unified reason that you can use to discuss an idea or debate an idea. You simply expose people for who they actually are and what side they belong to instead of actually engaging with truth.
Yes. And that's leading a good way to lead into my next point or my next question, which is, if all things are myth or this revolutionary speech,
Yeah.
what is the purpose of academic inquiry then?
Well, that's the real question. What the heck is the point of the academy?
Yeah.
And if it's not finding truth, because it's not.
Right.
If you're coming from this perspective, that's not the point. You're not there
So
to
what is the
find
point? That's
truth.
That's what I don't get from these guys.
Yeah. Well, there is a reason why these guys don't work in the sciences. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
So the fact is,
That's fair.
like, you can't be an engineer and have this approach.
Right.
So this is why it's really not only, but it's primarily entered into the humanities. That's where you really see this most strongly, where students are not taught to find truth in literature or in art or various other fields. Philosophy, depending on where you are, but a lot of philosophy actually still, thankfully, is especially in the kind of the analytic mode, still operates from a perspective of truth. There is truth, but in a lot of the fields of the humanities, that's not really the point. The point is activism.
Mm-hmm.
So, and like Marcuse says this very explicitly, that he wants to employ the youth as activists, social activists.
I hate this so much. It makes me so uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, and this is what has been referred to as the long march through the institutions that people have talked about. That in the 20th century there was this push to get leftist academics into the institutions that control Western society in order to change them, and not in such a way that those academics are, again, putting forth rational ideas to be debated, right? Which is the point of the university, right?
But they're putting them forward and silencing all of their voices.
Exactly.
And then
to just
using all that is produced to revolutionize the young.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
So what I see in a lot of this, though, is just utter discontentment with the world and everything in it. There's no positive or joyous view of the world in any way. Mm-hmm. And I think that matters.
Yeah, well, I think it's a way of viewing the world that is based on resentment.
Yeah.
Because it comes from this assumption, this is what you find in Foucault, that underneath everything is a dynamic of power. Mm-hmm. And that's all there really is. Right? Unmask. It's like, at the end of a Scooby-Doo episode where they unmask their person. It's like you unmask everything, and what do you see there? Power. That's it.
Yeah.
Unmask everything. Underneath everything, it's just power. And there's no real inherent good. There's no transcendent good that you're...
It's only transcendent evil.
It is.
Which is weird.
And so the only thing you can do is fight against the enemy, but that never ends. So the revolution never ends. This is the thing, is that like you're always going to find something to fight against, because that's your purpose, is to fight against oppression. So that and if there's no oppression anymore, you have no point. So you're just going to find more oppression somewhere. Yeah. You're going to make it up, or you're going to and of course the reality is there's always going to be evil in the world, so you're not going to escape that. Right. But it is a depressing way of viewing reality, that underneath everything is something that's actually evil. Right. Yeah. There's nothing good. And so when you're looking at the past, you're often looking at the past with resentment.
Yeah.
To just look for, what are the ideas in the past that were oppressive? What are the things that I can critique? Or
can we even read this person?
Yeah. Can we read this person because they said bad things about this or that?
Or they had slaves, therefore we should never.
And everything.
We shouldn't care about anything.
And everything is also looked at in the worst possible light.
Yes.
So you always assume the worst with people. You assume, instead of assuming the best, saying, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, you're always assuming that there is some hidden motive underneath what they're saying, which is the worst possible thing. Because if you view people's motivations as solely power and dynamics of power, if you view all relations as dynamics of power, if you believe there is no actual subsistent human essence or subject, but that people are created by dynamics of power, which is what Foucault says, well, that makes sense how you come to that perspective. And so it leaves you in a place to be bitter about the world all the time and to be skeptical of what everyone else says and people's motivations, because there's just the assumption underlying everything that there is this dynamic of oppression and power underneath everything. And to be clear, none of this is to say that there aren't power dynamics in the world and that there isn't oppression. Like, these things are obvious and people have always recognized this.
Yeah.
But is that the core of reality? Is that all there is?
It's interesting to me that in our culture at this particular moment, we've seen such a break between men and women, and especially younger men and women. I think that this is becoming increasingly true.
Yeah.
That women have been indoctrinated into the system thinking that they are constantly oppressed. There's no, they need to be privileged over men in a lot of ways. It's not even about equality anymore. It's about this privileging over. And then on the flip side, men are feeling disenfranchised and they're feeling as if they are the ones kind of receiving the butt end of all of the oppression. And so everybody feels as if they are the oppressed party.
Yes, that is very true. Exactly. Everybody does.
And in so doing, I think they've been bred to think this way, right? Yeah. Because this is the pervasive, the Foucaultian kind of power dynamics lie at the center of everything that these young people have been brought up into.
Yeah.
If everybody is oppressed, then everybody's constantly fighting each other.
Yes.
And I think that might be at the core of why men and women are having such a hard time finding partners.
Yeah, of course.
Right now.
Yeah, of course.
Which is so upsetting.
Well, that is the dynamic, because if you are, and this is especially social media, especially TikTok, has made this so much worse.
And even just on a practical level, marriage discourse itself has been kind of destroyed by this idea, which is it's me versus my husband.
Because you're always looking for the hidden motive behind, and you're like, oh, I didn't realize. You have this newfound like revelation. Like, I didn't realize that this was actually this psychological manipulation. Again, there is psychological manipulation, but not everything is that.
Yeah, it's that weaponizing competence that people point to a lot, I think, is another example of this, which is the intent of my husband not knowing how to do this thing that I always do, is him pretending to be incompetent so that I still have to do it.
So there's always, again, it's the worst motivation.
But that's not to say that people don't do that ever. But the point is, I think a lot of people are overstating these things because of this foundational assumption that everything is everything is the boogeyman.
But it's always directed outward.
Yes, it's never inward.
This is the problem, right? You never are. It's always about finding problems in everybody else.
It's the hidden evil motives in everyone except for me.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so if the reality is that, like, evil, and that could come down to power at times. Not all power is evil, obviously, but if that's something that's universal, then we need to take a look at ourselves too, and critical of ourselves too, because the fact is, to some extent, everyone manipulates people. Right? To some extent, everybody says things that maybe have hidden motives, or we all do that.
This is just a fundamental nature of being in community, and also language itself.
Yes.
Which is language is meant to persuade.
Yes.
And also state what is reality and convey it to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so people now find excuses to break out of any community, to break friendships, to break any relationship with their family, to get out of a relationship, excuses for any of that if their needs aren't met in this or that way, because they're reading some power dynamic and then they say it's toxic. Again, of course, there are things that are actually toxic, but you have to be able to differentiate between something that is like actually manipulative, narcissistic, sociopathic behavior and just normal human interaction, with a recognition that, people are going to do things that are kind of crappy. And guess what? You will too, and actually do a lot of the time. So,
which is why we need to repent.
Yes, exactly. That's kind of the point. It's this whole look at your own eye, right? So look at your own eye. And that's something people often are not doing. I just think it's very easy to have an excuse to blame everything else for what's wrong, instead of actually taking a look at yourself. But I also want to say that this way of looking at reality is one that's often based on resentment, is making people miserable. And it's demonstrable that people are more miserable. It's not a healthy way to live.
I know.
And I think that that's shown in so many ways. So it's not good for human flourishing. It's not good for people's relations. It's not good for how they view themselves.
The statistics around people feeling as if they have experienced trauma over the last 10 years.
I know.
Has shot through the roof. And same with diagnoses of mental illness. And it's not to say I think the diagnostic criteria has become better. It's been easier to diagnose people and people are more aware, etc.
But people are self-diagnosed.
But I do think there is something too, though, that people want to be victims or they want to be the oppressed class because that privileges them to speak on certain issues. And that is a fundamental thing that you find out when you look at all these thinkers, that the only way to be taken seriously is to be part of the oppressed class. So how are you going to be a part of that oppressed class?
And
you have to choose your adventure, I guess.
Of course. So the strange thing about it is that you end up trying to become oppressed because that's what gives you power.
Yes.
Which seems totally counterintuitive, but that's what you're ultimately doing.
But that's how it manifests.
I am oppressed so that you have to do what I say, and you have to shut up and listen to me because you're getting power from that.
Yes.
So you're actually wielding oppression as a way to have power over people. So it's a very odd kind of dynamic that happens here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this has manifested in an interesting way.
Yeah.
I would like to summarize here, or at least wrap up a little bit, to say we have experienced so many different ways in which our culture it feels wrong.
Yeah.
As Christians, I think we look at our culture and we go, it is a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
People don't even understand what truth is. People are so far gone. But I think having a basic grasp of these fundamental questions that need to be asked, and where scripture directs us to find these answers, equips us to then have these conversations with people. Yeah. And I think the biggest way that we as Christians can engage with our culture in a positive way is to meet people where they are in terms of these problematic viewpoints. I am a big fan, not only of Jordan, obviously I'm biased, but of this book. I think it is very helpful in a lot of ways, and I think you will like it. So I think you should get it. You can buy it on Amazon. The Kindle edition is now live. So if you are a Kindle person, you can get that as well.
And I'll make sure that it's up on the Kobo store too, by the time this is released.
Yeah. So you can
Barnes
get it.
And Noble, the Nook store too. So
yeah. Grab a copy. I hope you enjoy. If you want to hear us talk about any of these thinkers more, or any of the movements more, anything, really, leave your suggestions in the comments, and Jordan reads them. So if you're an expert and you disagree, he will actually look at it. Cool. Well, thanks for having me on again.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this. So make sure you subscribe. We'll see you in the next video or podcast.
Yeah. Bye.